a soul slowly turns away from light, not through dramatic rebellion, but through something far more insidious, a quiet corruption that Thomas Aquinas identified as humanity's most dangerous spiritual disease. Not murder, not theft, not even hatred in its rawest form. The sin he warned against doesn't announce itself with violence or spectacle. It works silently, methodically, like rot spreading through timber. By the time you recognize its presence, it's already rewritten how you see reality itself. Aquinas called it the root of all sin, the gateway through which every other evil enters the human heart. Yet most people live their entire lives never recognizing they're infected. They mistake its symptoms for virtues, its progression for personal growth. What emerges from Aquinas' analysis isn't just medieval moralizing, but a psychological portrait so precise it feels like he's describing your own inner life. The mechanisms he identified centuries ago map perfectly onto modern struggles, with meaning, purpose, and the quiet desperation that haunts even successful lives. If you're enjoying these explorations, I'd genuinely appreciate a like or subscribe. It makes a real difference in helping these ideas reach others who might need them. Drop a comment mentioning where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. There's something meaningful about our community spanning the globe, all connected through these philosophical questions. Now get comfortable. Maybe lower the lights. Let some ambient sound fill the space and settle in for tonight's exploration. We're diving into why Thomas Aquinas believed that pride isn't just another sin among many, but the fundamental corruption that makes every other evil possible. Part 1. The Architecture of Pride. To understand Aquinas' radical thesis about pride, you must first grasp how fundamentally he reimagined sin's nature. Sin isn't primarily about rule-breaking or divine displeasure. It's about reality distortion, a systematic misunderstanding of your place in existence's fundamental order. Pride, in Aquinas' precise terminology, is inordinate desire for one's own excellence. Not excellence itself, which is good, but the disordered appetite that seeks excellence in wrong ways, wrong measures, wrong relations to truth. This isn't about thinking highly of yourself when you've genuinely achieved something. It's about constructing a false narrative of self that requires reality to bend around your ego's demands. Pride makes you the center of your own universe, the measure of all things, the ultimate reference point for value and meaning. The logical structure supporting this analysis rests on Aquinas' understanding of being's hierarchy. God is pure being, infinite and self-sufficient. Creatures are finite being, radically dependent on God for their existence and continued operation. This isn't arbitrary ranking, but metaphysical necessity, following from the essence-existence distinction. Every created thing exhibits fundamental composition between what it is and the fact that it is. This composition marks creaturely dependence. Nothing finite causes its own existence or sustains itself in being. Everything depends ultimately on God as the uncaused ground of all reality. Pride rebels against this metaphysical truth. It treats the self as if it were self-sufficient, self-caused, self-justified. The proud person lives as if they owe their excellence to themselves alone, as if they're the author of their own being and worth. This generates immediate logical tensions with reality's actual structure. You didn't create yourself. You didn't choose your genetic inheritance, your birth circumstances, your fundamental capacities. Even your achievements depend on gifts you received involuntarily from nature, culture, and countless others. Yet pride constructs elaborate narratives, attributing everything to your own merit, effort, genius. It systematically edits out the dependence, the luck, the assistance, the infrastructure of support that makes any human accomplishment possible. Testing this conception against everyday experience reveals its penetrating accuracy. Notice how naturally we claim credit for successes while externalizing blame for failures. Notice how defensive we become when our self-narrative is challenged. Notice how much emotional energy we invest in maintaining particular self-images. This isn't conscious hypocrisy, but systematic self-deception that pride requires. The proud person can't acknowledge full dependence because it threatens their carefully constructed identity as self-made, self-sufficient, fundamentally superior. Aquinas distinguishes pride from proper self-respect through the concept of ordination. Proper self-respect acknowledges genuine goods you possess while recognizing them as gifts ultimately derived from God. It seeks excellence within appropriate limits, in proper relation to truth about your actual nature and capacities. Pride disorders this natural appetite for excellence by refusing limitations, rejecting dependence, and demanding recognition beyond what truth warrants. It's not about having too much self-esteem, but having self-esteem oriented wrongly, measuring yourself by false standards, seeking affirmation through reality distortion. The distinction between confidence and pride depends on truth orientation. Confidence rests on accurate self-assessment and appropriate trust in genuine capacities. Pride requires systematic exaggeration, selective attention, and defensive refusal to acknowledge limitations or dependence. This explains why proud people are often deeply insecure beneath their apparent confidence. The proud self is a construct requiring constant maintenance against reality's challenges. Every failure threatens the entire edifice. Every criticism must be deflected or reinterpreted to preserve the false narrative. Examining pride's internal logic reveals its parasitic relationship to genuine goods. Pride couldn't exist without the real excellences it distorts. You can't be proud of nothing. Pride requires actual achievements, real capacities, genuine goods that provide the raw material for disordered self-elevation. But pride corrupts these goods by claiming them as self-originating rather than received, by exaggerating their significance, by using them to establish false superiority over others. The achievement becomes weapon rather than gift. The capacity becomes grounds for contempt rather than gratitude. This generates Aquinas' startling claim that pride is the root of all sin. Not that pride temporarily precedes other sins, but that it creates the fundamental disorder making other sins possible. Pride establishes the disordered self-orientation that allows you to prefer your own perceived good over actual good, your own will over right reason and divine law. Testing this claim requires examining how other sins depend on pride's prior corruption. The murderer elevates his desire for revenge or his sense of injury over the victim's right to life. The thief privileges his want over another's property right. The adulterer ranks his pleasure above vows and others' welfare. Each particular sin involves preferring some disordered particular good over the proper order of goods. But this preference itself presupposes pride's more fundamental disorder, the claim that your desires and judgments should override reality's actual order and others' legitimate claims. Without pride's prior establishment of the disordered self as supreme reference point, why would you think your anger justifies murder? Your want justifies theft. Your pleasure justifies betrayal. Pride provides the framework within which these particular judgments become possible. This doesn't mean every sin involves conscious pride, or that sinners explicitly think, "I'm more important than reality's order." Pride often operates unconsciously, structuring perception and judgment without appearing in explicit thoughts. You don't think, "I'm the center of reality." You simply live as if you are, systematically preferring your own perceived good over actual good whenever they conflict. The problem of pride's universality poses immediate challenges. If pride is humanity's fundamental sin, and most people remain unaware of it, how do we escape systematic self-deception? How can the proud person recognize pride when pride itself distorts the self-perception necessary for recognition? Aquinas' response involves distinguishing degrees and modes of pride. Perfect pride claims equality with or superiority to God, either explicitly through direct rebellion or implicitly through practical atheism that lives without reference to divine order. This extreme form is rare because it's difficult to maintain consistently. More common is imperfect pride that acknowledges God theoretically, but practically operates as if you're the ultimate reference point for your own life. You assent to God's existence and authority on Sundays while living Monday through Saturday as if your judgments, desires, and self-assessment need no correction beyond your own standards. This generates the uncomfortable recognition that pride pervades ordinary life far more than extreme cases suggest. The subtle assumption that your perspective is obviously correct, that your desires deserve satisfaction, that your judgments need no external validation. These everyday attitudes reflect pride's quiet corruption. Part 2. The genealogy of pride's corruption. Understanding how pride enters and corrupts the soul requires tracing its development from initial seeds to full flowering. Aquinas provides sophisticated psychological analysis of pride's stages that maps remarkably onto modern insights about narcissism, self-deception, and identity formation. Pride begins not with dramatic rebellion, but with subtle shifts in attention and valuation. The initial movement involves what Aquinas calls vainglory, disordered desire for recognition and reputation. You begin valuing others' opinions about you more than truth about you. This seems innocent enough. Everyone wants to be liked, respected, recognized. But vainglory disorders this natural desire by making reputation primary and truth secondary. You become more concerned with appearing excellent than being excellent, more invested in others' perception than actual virtue. Testing this against everyday experience reveals its pervasive influence. Notice how much mental energy you devote to managing others' impressions, crafting your self-presentation, worrying about what people think. Notice how defensive you become when your reputation is questioned, how much relief you feel when praised. This isn't mere vanity in the superficial sense. It's fundamental disorder in how you relate to your own identity. Your sense of self becomes hostage to others' opinions, requiring constant external validation rather than resting on secure, internal foundation of genuine virtue and proper self-knowledge. The movement from vainglory to pride proper involves internalization. Initially, you seek others' recognition of excellences you may genuinely possess. But gradually, the need for external validation generates internal self-inflation. that persists even without external confirmation. You begin telling yourself stories about your excellence, intelligence, virtue that grow increasingly divorced from reality. What started as desire for deserved recognition becomes systematic self-aggrandizement, requiring no external warrant. This internalization process involves selective attention and motivated reasoning. You notice evidence supporting your inflated self-image while dismissing or reinterpreting contradicting evidence. You remember successes vividly while forgetting failures. You attribute achievements to your merit while externalizing blame for shortcomings. Aquinas identifies several mechanisms through which pride defends itself against reality's challenges. First, presumption, assuming you can achieve what exceeds your actual capacity. The proud person takes on projects beyond their ability, confident their excellence will overcome any obstacle. When inevitable failures occur, pride employs second defense, excuse-making that preserves self-image by attributing failure to external factors. It wasn't that you lacked ability, but that circumstances were unfair. Others interfered. The task wasn't really worth your full effort anyway. Third, contempt for others develops as necessary corollary to self-elevation. If you're excellent, others must be deficient. Pride requires establishing hierarchy with yourself at top, which means viewing others as inferior in ways justifying your superiority. This contempt manifests subtly through constant comparative thinking. You don't explicitly hate others, but automatically measure yourself against them, feeling satisfaction when you exceed them, and anxiety when they threaten your perceived superiority. Fourth, pride generates what Aquinas calls singularity, the desire to be different from and independent of others. The proud person wants to be exception to rules, unique in ways that exempt them from ordinary human limitations and obligations. This singularity creates isolation because genuine community requires acknowledging common humanity, shared limitations, mutual dependence. But pride can't tolerate such acknowledgement without threatening its narrative of self-sufficient superiority. The progression from vainglory through presumption, excuse-making, contempt, and singularity generates what Aquinas identifies as pride's daughters, the vices that follow from and express pride's fundamental disorder. Boasting, the compulsive need to proclaim your excellence to anyone who will listen. The proud person can't let achievements speak for themselves, but must ensure everyone knows about them, ideally in exaggerated form. Hypocrisy, pretending virtues you don't possess because your self-image requires being seen as morally superior. You perform goodness for observers while privately pursuing vice, maintaining public persona that contradicts private reality. Obstinacy, refusing to change your mind even when evidence clearly demonstrates you're wrong. Pride can't admit error without threatening the entire edifice of self-constructed superiority, so it digs in, doubles down, attacks critics rather than acknowledging mistakes. Discord, the inability to maintain peaceful relationships because pride requires constant assertion of your own will and judgment over others. You can't compromise, can't defer, can't acknowledge others might be right when you disagree. Disobedience to legitimate authority, whether divine or human, because pride can't tolerate subordination. You either deny the authority is legitimate or find ways to subvert it while maintaining appearance of compliance. Testing these daughters against your own life reveals Pride's pervasive influence. How often do you interrupt conversations to redirect attention to yourself? How much do you exaggerate achievements or embellish stories to make yourself look better? How defensive do you become when criticized? How quick to point out others' flaws when your own are mentioned? The genealogy of pride reveals its systematic character. It's not isolated vice, but comprehensive corruption affecting perception, judgment, relationships, and identity. Pride rewrites your entire psychological software, installing filters that systematically distort reality to serve ego's demands. This explains why pride is so difficult to recognize in yourself while being obvious in others. The very mechanisms that generate pride also prevent its recognition. You can't see your own self-deception because the deception operates at the level of what seems obvious and true to you. The proud person experiences their inflated self-assessment as simple accuracy. They're not being arrogant, just realistic about their excellence. They're not being defensive, just correcting others' mistaken impressions. They're not being contemptuous, just recognizing genuine differences in ability and worth. This systematic self-deception explains pride's entrenchment. Unlike sins that fight against conscience, pride corrupts conscience itself, redefining virtue and vice in ways that make pride seem like proper self-respect and humility seem like false modesty or cowardice. Part 3. Pride and the intellect's corruption. Aquinas' most penetrating analysis concerns how pride corrupts intellectual life, not just moral life. Pride doesn't merely make you conceited, it systematically distorts your capacity for knowing truth. This corruption proves especially dangerous because intellectual pride disguises itself as love of truth while actually serving ego's demands. The logical structure of intellectual pride involves preferring your own judgment to truth itself. Not consciously, not explicitly, but through systematic patterns of belief formation and revision that privilege ego protection over truth-seeking. Notice how naturally we assume our beliefs are correct without serious examination. Notice how threatened we feel when core beliefs are challenged. Notice how much more easily we accept confirming evidence than contradicting evidence. These aren't conscious decisions, but automatic operations reflecting intellect's corruption by pride. Aquinas distinguishes between two intellectual movements that pride disorders. First, curiosity, the desire to know, which is naturally good, but becomes vicious when disordered. Curiosity turns to vice when it seeks knowledge for wrong reasons, through wrong means, or beyond appropriate limits. The proud intellectual pursues knowledge not for truth's sake, but for self-aggrandizement. You want to know impressive things, own prestigious credentials, display erudition that demonstrates your superiority. Knowledge becomes trophy rather than truth, weapon rather than wisdom. Second, the judgment of truth, which pride corrupts by making self the ultimate arbiter rather than submitting to reality's demands. You judge what's true based on what fits your existing beliefs, serves your interests, confirms your self-image, rather than following evidence wherever it leads. This generates systematic intellectual dishonesty that feels like rigorous thinking. You demand overwhelming proof for claims you dislike while accepting minimal evidence for claims you prefer. You interpret ambiguous evidence in ways favorable to your position. You dismiss experts who disagree as biased while trusting those who confirm your views. Testing intellectual pride against philosophical practice reveals its pervasive corruption. Notice how philosophers often defend their distinctive positions long after evidence has shifted against them. Notice how academic debates become tribal, with scholars defending their school's views rather than following truth. Notice how difficult it is to change your mind about anything important, how much emotional investment you have in being right, how good it feels when your position is vindicated, and how painful when it's challenged. This emotional loading of belief reflects pride's corruption of intellectual life. Aquinas identifies specific patterns through which intellectual pride manifests: rashness, forming judgments without sufficient evidence because you trust your initial impressions more than you should. The proud person assumes their quick intuitive grasp must be correct rather than subjecting it to rigorous examination. Inconstancy, constantly changing positions not through following evidence, but through susceptibility to fashion, peer pressure, and desire for novelty. Your beliefs shift with whatever makes you look sophisticated or positions you advantageously rather than through genuine inquiry. Obstinacy's intellectual form, refusing to revise beliefs when evidence clearly demands it. You've invested so much in particular positions that abandoning them threatens your identity. So you dig in, find creative ways to dismiss contradicting evidence, attack sources rather than engaging arguments. The sophist's temptation, using arguments as weapons to win debates rather than tools to find truth. You become skilled at constructing clever arguments for whatever position serves your purposes, caring more about defeating opponents than discovering reality. These intellectual vices share common root in pride's fundamental disorder, treating your own judgment as ultimate authority rather than submitting to truth's demands. The remedy isn't skepticism about all beliefs, but proper intellectual humility that acknowledges fallibility while pursuing truth seriously. But intellectual humility proves extraordinarily difficult because it requires acknowledging you might be fundamentally wrong about important things. Pride can't tolerate this acknowledgement without severe threat to constructed self-image as intelligent, rational, right-thinking person. This explains why intelligent people often cling to demonstrably false beliefs with more tenacity than less intelligent people. Intelligence provides tools for defending beliefs through sophisticated rationalization, while pride provides motivation for employing those tools to protect ego rather than seek truth. The corruption of intellectual life by pride extends to how we relate to authorities and traditions. The proud intellectual must establish independence, demonstrating they've thought through everything themselves rather than relying on others' insights. This generates contempt for tradition as mere received opinion that your superior intellect has transcended. But this contempt ignores that all thinking depends on inherited frameworks, concepts, and methods. You can't think about anything without using language, logic, and categories you didn't invent. The appearance of intellectual independence rests on systematic amnesia about the immense debt you owe to countless previous thinkers. Aquinas contrasts intellectual pride with proper confidence in reason's power. Reason is genuine gift capable of knowing truth about reality. But reason operates properly only when acknowledging its limits, its dependence on sense experience and divine illumination, its need for correction through dialogue and tradition. The remedy for intellectual pride isn't abandoning reason, but submitting it to reality's discipline. You must learn to follow arguments wherever they lead, even when conclusions threaten your self-image. You must develop emotional detachment from being right, finding satisfaction in discovering truth, even when it means acknowledging previous error. This proves extraordinarily difficult in practice. Try genuinely arguing against your own position sometime, not just rehearsing counter-arguments you'll refute, but actually entertaining the possibility you're wrong and your opponent's right. Notice the visceral resistance, the defensive reactions, the automatic generation of objections. That resistance is pride protecting its territory. It experiences potential error as existential threat because you've made being right central to your identity. Admitting you're wrong about something important means admitting your judgment isn't as reliable as you assumed, which threatens the entire narrative of intellectual superiority pride requires. Part 4. Pride in relationships and community. Pride's corruption extends beyond internal psychological life to systematically destroy genuine relationship and community. Aquinas' analysis reveals how pride makes authentic connection impossible because it requires maintaining false self while treating others as instruments for ego's projects. The logical structure of pride's relational corruption involves fundamental contradiction between pride's demands and relationship's requirements. Genuine relationship requires mutual recognition, vulnerability, acknowledgement of dependence. Pride requires maintaining superiority, hiding weakness, asserting independence. You can't truly connect with someone while simultaneously trying to prove you're better than them. You can't receive love while insisting you need nothing. You can't build trust while hiding behind carefully crafted persona designed to impress rather than reveal. Testing this against everyday relationships reveals pride's pervasive damage. Notice how often conversations become competitions where you're trying to top others' stories, redirect attention to yourself, demonstrate your experiences are more impressive, your knowledge more extensive, your suffering more profound. Notice how rarely you actually listen to others versus waiting for your turn to speak. Notice how much energy you invest in presenting idealized version of yourself rather than revealing actual struggles, doubts, limitations. Notice how defensive you become when others see through your performance to the insecurity beneath. Aquinas identifies several mechanisms through which pride corrupts relationships. First, comparison, the automatic ranking of self versus others that pride requires. You can't simply appreciate someone else's achievement. You must immediately measure it against your own, feeling threatened if theirs seems greater, satisfied if yours exceeds. This constant comparison prevents genuine celebration of others' goods. Their success becomes your failure because pride has made everything zero-sum competition for superiority. You can't delight in their happiness without simultaneously feeling your own relative diminishment. Second, contempt, the systematic devaluation of others that pride needs to maintain self-elevation. If you're superior, others must be inferior in ways that justify your elevated status. This generates automatic fault-finding, dismissive attitudes, subtle put-downs disguised as jokes or honest observations. The contempt often operates subtly through tone, body language, and selective attention rather than explicit insults. You don't consciously hate people, you just consistently notice their flaws while overlooking their virtues. Remember their failures while forgetting their successes. Interpret their actions uncharitably while granting yourself generous interpretations. Third, the inability to apologize genuinely or forgive completely. Apologizing requires acknowledging you were wrong, which threatens pride's narrative of your superior judgment and virtue. You either refuse to apologize at all or offer non-apologies that deflect blame. "I'm sorry you were offended," rather than "I'm sorry I was wrong." Similarly, forgiving requires acknowledging someone else's dignity and worth despite their offense against you. But pride has constructed hierarchy with you at top, which makes genuine forgiveness feel like conceding ground. Admitting their worth challenges your superiority. Fourth, the compulsive need to prove yourself right in every disagreement. You can't simply let things go, can't agree to disagree, can't acknowledge others might have valid points, even when you ultimately maintain your position. Every disagreement becomes battle for dominance that you must win to preserve self-image. This makes conversations exhausting rather than enriching. Others learn to avoid topics that trigger your defensive reactions, to let you win arguments even when you're clearly wrong, to manage your ego rather than engage authentically. Relationships become performances rather than connections. Aquinas' analysis of pride's effect on community proves especially relevant for understanding modern social fragmentation. Pride makes genuine community impossible because community requires acknowledging common humanity, shared limitations, mutual dependence that pride systematically denies. The proud person experiences community membership as threat to uniqueness rather than source of enrichment. You must establish yourself as exception, as superior to the masses, as independent of the support and solidarity that binds others together. This generates the paradox that proud people are often desperately lonely despite surrounding themselves with admirers. Admirers aren't friends because friendship requires mutual recognition and vulnerability. Admirers serve ego's need for validation, while actual self remains hidden and isolated. The loneliness proves peculiarly painful because it can't be acknowledged without threatening pride's narrative of self-sufficient superiority. You can't admit you need people without admitting dependence. You can't seek help without admitting limitation. So you suffer isolation while maintaining appearance of confident independence. Testing this against contemporary culture reveals pride's systematic destruction of social fabric. Notice how social media encourages curated self-presentation. Highlight reels that systematically exclude struggle and vulnerability. Notice how it facilitates constant comparison and competitive display of lifestyle, achievement, beauty. Notice how it rewards attention-seeking behavior, encourages inflammatory takes designed more to demonstrate cleverness than pursue truth, generates pile-ons where mobs attack targets to demonstrate their own virtue. These patterns reflect pride's corruption operating at cultural scale. The remedy Aquinas proposes involves cultivating humility, not false modesty that pretends you lack genuine goods, but truthful recognition of your actual nature, gifts, and limitations. Humility acknowledges excellence where it exists, while refusing the disordered self-elevation that pride demands. But cultivating humility proves extraordinarily difficult because pride resists every attempt at correction. The proud person experiences calls to humility as insults, attacks on their legitimate self-worth, attempts to diminish their real excellence through false egalitarian ideology. This defensive reaction itself reveals pride's presence. Genuine excellence doesn't require defensive protection. because it's secure in its reality. The need to defend your excellence, to ensure everyone recognizes it, to attack those who question it, these reactions expose the insecurity pride masks through aggressive self-assertion. Part 5. The spiritual death. Pride causes Aquinas' most sobering claim concerns pride's ultimate consequence, spiritual death, the soul's separation from God that constitutes damnation. This isn't arbitrary punishment, but necessary result of pride's fundamental orientation away from reality's source toward constructed false self. The logical structure connecting pride to damnation involves several steps. First, sin is privation of due good, absence of proper orientation toward genuine fulfillment. Second, human fulfillment consists ultimately in union with God through knowledge and love. Third, pride establishes fundamental orientation away from God toward disordered self-love. Therefore, pride makes the very movement toward ultimate fulfillment impossible. Not because God refuses relationship with the proud, but because pride constructs false self that can't receive what God offers. It's like turning away from sun while complaining about darkness. Testing this against religious experience reveals its psychological accuracy. Notice how pride makes genuine worship impossible. Worship requires acknowledging something greater than yourself, submitting to authority beyond your judgment, celebrating goodness you didn't create and can't control. But pride has made yourself the supreme reference point, the ultimate authority, the measure of all value. Genuine worship threatens this entire construct. So the proud person either avoids worship entirely or performs it superficially while internally maintaining elevated sense of self that contradicts worship's meaning. Aquinas distinguishes between two movements in spiritual life that pride systematically disorders. First, the ascent to God through contemplation and love. This requires progressively letting go of attachment to created goods, including self-image and self-will, to rest in uncreated good itself. But pride clings desperately to self-image and self-will as supreme goods. It can't surrender them without experiencing ego death that feels like actual death. So it resists the upward movement, preferring comfortable, self-constructed world to the terrifying surrender genuine spirituality demands. Second, the reception of grace, God's self-communication that heals sin and enables virtue. But grace can't be earned through achievement or controlled through technique. It's pure gift that must be received with empty hands, acknowledged dependence, grateful humility. Pride can't tolerate this gift structure. It wants to earn salvation, control relationship with God, claim credit for whatever spiritual progress occurs. The radical passivity grace requires, the acknowledgement that you contribute nothing to your own redemption except the sin requiring it. This proves intolerable to pride's demands. This generates the paradox that trying harder to be holy can increase pride rather than reducing it. You begin taking credit for your spiritual achievements, feeling superior to less disciplined people, using your virtue to establish hierarchy with yourself at top. The spiritual competitor becomes proud of their extensive prayer practice, their theological knowledge, their ascetical rigor, their depth of religious experience. What began as movement toward God becomes occasion for self-elevation that moves away from God. Aquinas identifies this as the most dangerous form of pride because it disguises itself as virtue. The spiritually proud person appears holy to others and even to themselves. They fulfill external religious obligations, speak proper theological language, display appropriate devotional attitudes. But underneath, they've made spirituality serve ego's projects rather than submitting ego to God's transforming grace. They're using God as instrument for self-construction rather than allowing God to deconstruct false self and reveal true self found only in divine relationship. Testing this against spiritual traditions reveals its universality. Buddhist teachers warn against meditation becoming occasion for pride in your attainment. Sufi masters emphasize that every spiritual state can become veil if you grasp it rather than passing through to reality beyond. Christian saints throughout history describe pride as the most persistent temptation precisely because it operates even in, especially in, advanced spiritual states. The devil doesn't tempt saints to obvious sins, but to subtle pride in their sanctity. The connection between pride and damnation becomes clearer when examining what damnation actually means in Aquinas' framework. Hell isn't primarily torture imposed by angry God, but natural consequence of definitive rejection of God as ultimate good. The damned don't suffer primarily from external punishment, but from internal privation. Having made themselves, rather than God, their ultimate end, they achieve what they chose: permanent self-enclosure, cut off from the only source of true happiness. Pride is precisely this self-enclosure in its most extreme form. It constructs impenetrable fortress of self-justifying ego that admits no challenge, acknowledges no dependence, receives no gift. This fortress feels safe and necessary to the proud person, but it's actually prison, preventing access to the only good that could truly satisfy. The remedy Aquinas proposes involves what later spiritual traditions call ego death or kenosis, the radical emptying of self-constructed identity to make room for God's transforming presence. This isn't self-destruction, but self-discovery, letting go of false self to find true self. But pride experiences this letting go as ultimate threat. Everything you've constructed, every achievement you've claimed, every image you've maintained, all of it must be released. The carefully crafted narrative of who you are must be exposed as fiction. The self-sufficient ego must acknowledge its utter dependence. This proves so terrifying that most people avoid genuine spirituality entirely, preferring comfortable religious performance that never threatens ego's constructed reality. They attend services, follow rules, affirm doctrines while keeping God safely contained where he can't challenge the fundamental orientation of their lives. The rare souls who pursue authentic spiritual transformation report that dying to pride feels precisely like dying. The loss of ego's constructed supports generates panic, desperation, the sense that if you let go, nothing will catch you and you'll fall into void. This terror is pride's final defense, the last attempt to prevent its own destruction. But spiritual teachers across traditions testify that what feels like falling into void is actually falling into God's hands. That ego death leads to resurrection into truer life. That losing false self means finding true self. Part 6. The cultural manifestations of pride. Examining how pride manifests culturally rather than just individually reveals its systematic destruction of civilization itself. Aquinas' analysis provides framework for understanding contemporary social pathologies as expressions of collective pride operating at scale. The logical structure of cultural pride involves the same fundamental disorder as individual pride, but amplified through collective self-justification. Nations, institutions, ideologies all develop proud narratives of their own excellence, superiority, unique virtue that justify dominating or dismissing others. Testing this against historical examples reveals pride's consistent patterns across cultures. Every imperial power justifies its conquests through claims of civilizational superiority. Every revolutionary movement proclaims its unique insight into history's meaning. Every established order defends itself as natural, necessary, obviously superior to alternatives. American exceptionalism provides clear example of collective pride. The narrative of America as uniquely virtuous nation with special divine mission systematically edits out conquest, slavery, exploitation, while exaggerating achievements and moral standing. This isn't conscious propaganda, but systematic self-deception operating culturally. Similar patterns appear in every culture. China's civilizational pride in being the Middle Kingdom, Europe's pride in Enlightenment rationality and progress, the Soviet Union's pride in scientific socialism's inevitable triumph. Each represents disordered collective self-elevation, requiring reality distortion. Aquinas' analysis helps explain why these proud narratives persist despite contradicting evidence. Like individual pride, cultural pride generates defensive mechanisms protecting its constructed superiority. Contradicting evidence is dismissed, reinterpreted, or attacked rather than acknowledged. When American history of racial violence is raised, proud patriots respond that every nation has dark chapters, that America's ideals ultimately prevailed, that critics hate America and deny its genuine achievements. The pattern exactly parallels individual pride's defensive excuse-making and attack on critics. The corruption of intellectual life by pride scales to cultural level through what Aquinas would recognize as collective sophistry. Arguments become weapons deployed to defend tribes' position rather than tools for finding truth. Sophistication in argument serves pride's demands rather than truth-seeking. Notice how political discourse functions today. Each side constructs a bubble of confirming information, interpretive frameworks that systematically favor their position, sophisticated arguments for why they're right, and opponents wicked or stupid. The goal isn't truth, but victory in status competition. This generates toxic dynamic where admitting error becomes impossible without admitting your entire tribal identity was misguided. You can't change your mind about important issues without experiencing it as betrayal of community, loss of belonging, identity crisis. The proud tribe demands loyalty to collective narrative more than commitment to truth. Questioning the narrative marks you as traitor, outsider, threat to community's constructed superiority. So members police each other's conformity while claiming they're the ones thinking independently. Aquinas' analysis of singularity, pride's desire to be exception and independent, helps explain contemporary individualism's pathologies. Consumer capitalism cultivates pride by promising you can express unique, authentic self through purchasing right products, displaying right lifestyle, curating right image. But this individuality is mass-produced, everyone expressing their uniqueness through same narrow range of approved options. You're not actually independent, but conforming to sophisticated system that profits from your desire to appear special. The social media economy runs entirely on pride's fuel. Platforms are designed to encourage comparative thinking, status competition, curated self-presentation. Every feature, likes, followers, viral moments serves pride's demand for recognition and superiority display. Notice how social media use correlates with anxiety, depression, loneliness, despite its promise of connection. This makes perfect sense through Aquinas' lens. Pride destroys genuine relationship while generating desperate need for validation. Social media provides validation's appearance without relationship's reality. The influencer economy represents pride culture's logical conclusion. Professional narcissists monetizing their cultivated superior image, performing authenticity while carefully controlling presentation, selling fantasy that you too could be special, enviable, worthy of attention. Testing Aquinas' analysis against contemporary cancel culture reveals pride's operation. The righteous pylons, where mobs attack someone for moral failing, serve multiple pride functions simultaneously. They establish attackers' moral superiority, provide opportunity for virtue display, allow satisfying contempt towards someone lower in moral hierarchy. But the mob's righteousness is itself pride operating collectively. The inability to forgive, the refusal of redemption possibilities, the gleeful cruelty disguised as justice, all reflect pride's need to establish and maintain moral hierarchy with righteous mob at top and condemned sinner at bottom. Aquinas would recognize the dynamic perfectly. The person casting first stone wasn't objectively more righteous than others, just better at hiding sin and more eager to demonstrate superiority through condemning someone else's. Modern cancelers display precisely this pattern at cultural scale. The remedy involves what Aquinas calls humility, culturally expressed as acknowledgement of shared humanity, common limitations, collective dependence on countless others' contributions. No nation is exceptional in moral standing. No ideology possesses complete truth. No group can claim pure virtue, justifying contempt for others. But cultural humility proves even more difficult than individual humility because it threatens group identity, status hierarchies, systems of power built on pride's narratives. Admitting your nation's crimes, your ideology's blindness, your group's complicity in injustice feels like betraying your people. This explains resistance to critical history, defensive reactions when group sins are named, the desire to sanitize past through omission or minimization. It's collective pride defending itself against reality's challenges through same mechanisms individual pride employs. Part 7. The philosophical problem of pride. Examining pride through philosophical lens, rather than just theological, reveals deep tensions in Aquinas' account that modern philosophy has exposed. The relationship between proper self-love and disordered pride, between confidence and arrogance, between humility and servility, proves more complex than medieval framework suggests. The central philosophical challenge concerns whether pride is actually vice at all. Aristotle, whom Aquinas generally follows, praised megalopsychia, greatness of soul, which involves thinking yourself worthy of great things when you actually are worthy. This sounds like pride in ordinary usage. Aquinas distinguishes megalopsychia from pride by claiming the great-souled person accurately assesses their worth and seeks recognition proportionate to it, while the proud person overestimates worth and seeks excessive recognition. But determining accurate assessment versus overestimation proves extremely difficult in practice. Modern philosophy, particularly Nietzsche, challenges the entire framework by questioning whether humility is virtue at all. Nietzsche argues that Christian humility is actually disguised resentment. Weak people's attempt to make their weakness into virtue while denigrating strength as vice. In Nietzsche's analysis, what Christianity calls pride is actually noble self-affirmation that strong people naturally express. What Christianity calls humility is actually self-loathing that weak people develop when they can't achieve excellence, then project onto everyone through universal moral demands. Testing this critique against Aquinas reveals genuine tensions. Is acknowledging your excellence really pride's beginning, or is it just honest self-assessment? Is seeking recognition for genuine achievement disordered desire, or natural appetite for just reward? Is refusing to defer to others based on their claimed authority really pride or appropriate independence? The line between proper confidence and proud arrogance seems to depend on accurate self-assessment. But pride's fundamental problem, according to Aquinas, is that it disorders the very capacity for accurate self-assessment. So you can't know if you're properly confident or pridefully arrogant, because pride corrupts the judgment needed to distinguish them. This generates potential circularity in diagnosing pride. If you think you're appropriately confident, pride would lead you to that exact thought. If you're worried you might be proud, that worry might itself be pride's sophisticated disguise, using false humility to avoid real examination. The psychological literature on narcissism provides empirical dimension to these philosophical questions. Clinical narcissists display many features Aquinas attributes to pride: inflated self-image, need for constant validation, inability to handle criticism, contempt for others, relationship difficulties. But research reveals that narcissism often develops as defensive response to deep insecurity, shame, and inadequacy. The grandiose, self-presentation masks vulnerable core that can't tolerate exposure. This complicates the pride diagnosis because it suggests what looks like pride might actually be desperate defense against self-hatred. Aquinas acknowledges this complexity by distinguishing pride's root from its manifestations. The fundamental disorder is preferring your own excellence to proper order, but this can express through opposite behaviors. Some proud people display obvious arrogance. Others display false humility that's secretly proud of their humility. The philosophical problem deepens when considering whether complete elimination of self-preference is possible or desirable. Don't you necessarily act from your own perspective, motivated by your own interests, pursuing what seems good to you? How can you not prefer your own good when all action originates from your own will? Aquinas would respond that proper self-love seeks your genuine good within right order of goods. You prefer your eternal, flourishing in God over temporal pleasures, your true good over apparent goods, goods rightly ordered over goods sought disorderly. But pride disorders the self-love by making self ultimate end rather than finding self's true end in God. Yet this response raises questions about motivation's nature. If you seek God only because it's your true good, aren't you still ultimately self-interested? If you act virtuously because it fulfills your nature, is that really transcending pride's self-orientation, or just expressing it sophisticatedly? The Kantian critique of eudaimonistic ethics presses this objection. True morality requires acting from duty regardless of your happiness. Acting virtuously to achieve fulfillment is still too tied to self-interest to count as genuinely moral. Only self-sacrificing action for duty's sake transcends pride's corruption. But Aquinas would reject this dichotomy between self-interest and morality. Proper self-interest, rightly understood, is identical with genuine morality because your true good is found only in rightly ordered action. Pride doesn't consist in seeking your good, but in seeking it disorderly, making yourself ultimate rather than finding yourself in God. Contemporary ethics complicates these questions through attention to social construction of self. The autonomous choosing self that pride seems to presuppose may itself be cultural construct rather than natural reality. Maybe what Aquinas condemns as pride is actually appropriate assertion of self against oppressive demand for submission. Feminist philosophers particularly challenge humility's virtue when it's been weaponized to keep women subordinate. Is encouraging humility in oppressed groups really combating vice, or is it reinforcing unjust power structures? Maybe what looks like pride is actually legitimate resistance to illegitimate authority. These challenges don't necessarily refute Aquinas, but demand more careful articulation of pride's nature. The issue isn't self-affirmation per se, but disordered self-affirmation that requires reality distortion. The problem isn't confidence, but false confidence. The problem isn't seeking recognition, but seeking recognition beyond what truth warrants. But determining what truth warrants proves extraordinarily difficult. Who decides? By what standard? Using what process? These questions reveal that pride's diagnosis requires background judgments about proper order, legitimate authority, accurate self-assessment that themselves admit contestation. Part 8. The psychological dynamics of pride. Modern psychology provides rich empirical confirmation of patterns Aquinas identified conceptually, while also revealing complexities he couldn't anticipate. The relationship between pride, narcissism, shame, and authentic self-esteem proves more intricate than medieval frameworks suggested. Research on narcissism distinguishes between grandiose and vulnerable types. Grandiose narcissists display obvious self-aggrandizement, need for admiration, lack of empathy that maps closely onto Aquinas' pride description. But vulnerable narcissists present differently, displaying excessive sensitivity to criticism, feelings of inadequacy, shame-proneness. Yet both types share underlying structure of fragile self-esteem dependent on external validation. The apparent confidence masks deep insecurity about self-worth that requires constant reinforcement through achievement, recognition, superiority over others. This confirms Aquinas' insight that pride and insecurity aren't opposites, but intimately connected. The proud person's defensive aggression, need to prove themselves, inability to tolerate criticism, all reveal underlying fragility that apparent confidence disguises. Testing this against your own experience reveals the pattern. Notice how your most grandiose moments often follow periods of doubt or criticism. Notice how need to assert superiority intensifies when you're feeling inadequate. Notice how defensive reactions reveal the insecurity you're trying to hide. The psychological research on self-esteem reveals important distinctions. Healthy self-esteem involves stable, positive self-regard based on accurate self-knowledge, acceptance of limitations, security that doesn't require constant validation. This aligns with what Aquinas calls proper self-love or humility. But contingent self-esteem depends on meeting particular standards or outperforming others. Your worth fluctuates with achievement, appearance, status relative to others. This creates psychological fragility because your fundamental self-regard depends on factors partly outside your control. Pride operates through contingent self-esteem structure. You feel good about yourself when you're succeeding, superior, recognized. But this positive feeling remains fundamentally unstable because it depends on maintaining success and superiority. Any failure threatens the entire edifice. Research on social comparison reveals how pervasively we engage in comparing ourselves to others, both upward comparison with those better off and downward comparison with those worse off. Upward comparison often generates envy and motivation for improvement, but can also produce despair when gap seems unbridgeable. Downward comparison produces satisfaction through recognizing you're better off than others, but reflects exactly the contempt Aquinas identifies as pride's daughter. You need others to be worse off so you can feel good about yourself through comparison. The contemporary attention economy systematically cultivates pride through engineering environments that encourage constant comparison, status signaling, performance of success. Social media platforms profit from keeping you anxious about how you measure up, motivating endless content creation and consumption. This generates epidemic of anxiety, depression, loneliness despite, or perhaps because of unprecedented connectivity. You're constantly aware of how everyone else appears to be living better lives, having more exciting experiences, looking more attractive, achieving more success. The psychological cost proves severe. Studies show social media use correlates with decreased well-being, increased anxiety and depression, greater loneliness. The mechanisms map precisely onto pride's relational corruption that Aquinas described. Constant comparison and status competition destroy genuine connection while intensifying need for validation. The research on imposter syndrome reveals another dimension of pride's psychology. High achievers often experience persistent doubt about whether they deserve success, fear of being exposed as fraud, inability to internalize accomplishments. They attribute success to luck or external factors while attributing failure to their genuine inadequacy. This seems opposite to pride's self-aggrandizement, but closer examination reveals shared structure. Both pride and imposter syndrome involve disordered relationship to your actual capacities and worth. Pride overestimates and aggrandizes. Imposter syndrome underestimates and dismisses. Neither achieves accurate self-assessment and stable self-regard Aquinas identifies as humility. The connection becomes clearer when recognizing that imposter syndrome often affects people in competitive achievement-oriented environments where worth is measured by performance. Your sense of self becomes hostage to achievement in ways that generate either pride when succeeding or imposter syndrome when success feels unearned. The psychological literature on shame provides crucial insight into pride's development. Shame involves feeling fundamentally defective, unworthy of love and belonging, exposed and humiliated. It's among most painful emotions humans experience, threatening the self at deepest levels. Pride develops partly as defense against shame. If feeling fundamentally defective is intolerable, you can construct opposite narrative of superiority, excellence, special status that protects against shame's possibility. The grandiose self becomes armor against the vulnerable self that shame would expose. This explains why proud people react so violently to criticism or failure. It's not just ego injury, but threat to the entire defensive structure protecting against underlying shame. If the proud self is exposed as false, the shame it's been defending against breaks through with overwhelming force. The therapeutic literature emphasizes that healing narcissism requires not attacking the grandiose self directly, but building genuine self-worth that doesn't depend on superiority or achievement. The person needs to develop what Aquinas would call proper self-love, stable recognition of intrinsic worth, independent of performance. But achieving this proves extraordinarily difficult because it requires experiencing exactly the vulnerability and ordinariness that pride has been defending against. You must acknowledge you're not special, not superior, not exempt from human limitation and dependence. For someone whose entire identity is built on being special, this feels like death. Part 9. The Path to Humility. Having examined pride's nature, mechanisms, and consequences, we must consider Aquinas' account of pride's remedy. Humility isn't merely pride's absence, but positive virtue requiring cultivation through specific practices and internal transformations. The logical structure of humility involves right ordering of self-assessment and desire for excellence. Humility acknowledges genuine goods you possess while recognizing them as gifts rather than self-generated. It seeks excellence within proper limits, in right relation to God and others, without disordered self-elevation. This isn't false modesty that denies real excellence or accomplishment. Aquinas explicitly condemns excessive self-abasement as vice opposite to pride. The humble person accurately assesses their capacities and achievements while refusing the pride that would claim them as self-caused or use them to establish superiority. Testing this against spiritual practice reveals humility's active character. It's not passive acceptance of diminishment, but energetic pursuit of truth about yourself, others, and God. The humble person seeks to see reality clearly without the distortions pride introduces. Aquinas identifies several practices that cultivate humility. First, meditation on human nature's limitations and dependence. Recognize that you didn't create yourself, don't sustain yourself, can't guarantee your continued existence. Everything you are and have depends on countless factors beyond your control. This meditation proves psychologically difficult because it threatens pride's narrative of self-sufficient independence. But it's simply acknowledging truth. You depend on oxygen you didn't create, food grown by others' labor, languages and concepts inherited from tradition, social infrastructure provided by countless workers. Even your achievements depend on genetic gifts you did nothing to earn, opportunities that luck and privilege provided, assistance from mentors and supporters, timing and circumstances you didn't control. Honest examination reveals that what you contribute is real but limited, always building on foundation you didn't lay. Second, meditation on your own sins and failures. Not to generate self-loathing, but to maintain realistic perspective on your actual moral status. You failed, hurt others, acted selfishly, fallen short of ideals you claim to hold. Remembering this prevents the moral superiority that pride requires. This practice faces the danger of descending into scrupulosity or shame that generates more pride through excessive self-focus. The goal isn't endless self-condemnation, but honest acknowledgement that you're flawed like everyone else, that you need grace and forgiveness, that you lack grounds for contempt toward others' failings. Third, practicing deference to others and submission to legitimate authority. Not servile obsequiousness, but recognition that others have knowledge, wisdom, authority in domains where you should submit to their judgment rather than asserting your own. This proves extraordinarily difficult for proud people who've made intellectual independence and refusal of submission central to their identity. But it's simply acknowledging that you can't be expert in everything, that others genuinely know more than you in their domains, that cooperation requires sometimes deferring to others' judgment. Fourth, seeking correction and feedback rather than only praise and validation. The humble person wants to know truth about themselves, even when it's unflattering. They actively seek criticism that would help them improve, rather than only seeking affirmation of their excellence. This requires developing emotional resilience to handle criticism without defensive reactions. You must learn to separate criticism of your actions or ideas from attacks on your fundamental worth. You must distinguish legitimate feedback from baseless attacks without dismissing all criticism as the latter. Fifth, practicing service to others, particularly those lower in status or ability. This concretely enacts humility by placing yourself below others, attending to their needs, using your gifts for their benefit rather than your own aggrandizement. The practice becomes pride's occasion if you're proud of your service, if you do it to demonstrate your superior virtue, if you use it to feel good about yourself through comparison to those you serve. Genuine service requires serving without thought of reward, recognition, or superiority. Sixth, accepting humiliations and diminishments without complaint or resentment. When you're criticized, overlooked, treated unfairly, your response reveals whether you've achieved humility or remain proud. The proud person reacts with defensive anger, hurt feelings, need to vindicate themselves, and attack critics. The humble person can bear diminishment without their fundamental self-worth being threatened because it doesn't depend on others' recognition or on avoiding all criticism. Seventh, contemplating Christ's humility as model and inspiration. For Christian tradition, Christ's incarnation, humble birth, service to others, and death on cross provide ultimate example of humility. God himself submits to human limitations, serves human needs, accepts humiliation and death. This provides both model to imitate and grace to enable imitation. You can't achieve humility through willpower alone because pride operates too deeply, structuring perception and motivation unconsciously. Only divine grace working through contemplation and sacramental practice can transform pride's fundamental orientation. Testing these practices against your own experience reveals how resistant pride is to correction. Try genuinely acknowledging your dependence for one day. Notice how, automatically, you claim credit for achievements, how defensive you become when criticized, how much energy you invest in managing others' impressions. Try practicing service without any recognition. Notice how much you want others to know about your good deeds, how disappointed you feel when service goes unnoticed, how easily you feel resentful toward those you serve when they don't show sufficient appreciation. The difficulty reveals that pride has structured your entire psychological and social life. Dismantling it requires not just occasional practices, but fundamental transformation of your basic orientation toward yourself, others, and God. Aquinas emphasizes that humility is ultimately gift rather than achievement. The attempt to achieve humility through your own effort can become occasion for pride in your spiritual progress. You become proud of your humility, which is self-contradictory corruption that's distressingly common. The remedy involves paradoxical combination of active practice and passive reception. You must practice the exercises that cultivate humility while acknowledging that humility itself, if it comes, will be divine gift rather than your achievement. You cooperate with grace, but recognize grace does the real work. This proves frustratingly indirect for people who want to control their spiritual development through technique and effort. But the indirectness is essential. Humility can't be achieved directly because direct attempt makes it your achievement, which generates pride. It must come as byproduct of other directed practices and divine transformation. Part 10. Living with pride's reality. Having examined pride's nature, consequences, and theoretical remedy, we must acknowledge the existential reality of living as a person who remains significantly proud despite understanding pride's corruption. For most people, most of the time, pride isn't overcome, but managed, accommodated, occasionally reduced, while never entirely eliminated. This creates an uncomfortable gap between ideal and reality that Aquinas' systematic theology doesn't fully address. His framework provides clear account of pride as fundamental sin, humility as essential virtue, grace as transforming power. But lived experience involves messy, ongoing struggle where pride persistently reasserts itself despite your best efforts. The practical challenge involves maintaining religious and ethical commitment while acknowledging that you remain proud in ways that contradict your commitments. You believe humility is virtue and pride is vice. You've experienced pride's damage in your relationships and spiritual life. Yet you keep acting proudly despite knowing better. This generates familiar dynamics of religious hypocrisy, where you condemn in others what you practice yourself. Not conscious hypocrisy, but failure to align practice with principles. Failure that pride itself makes more likely by blinding you to your own faults while highlighting others. Testing this against honest self-examination reveals how pervasive the gap is. You can affirm humility as virtue while still habitually comparing yourself to others, still feeling superior when you exceed them, still getting defensive when criticized, still needing validation and recognition. You can practice religious disciplines meant to cultivate humility while using those very practices to feel superior to less disciplined people. You can study texts condemning pride while feeling proud of your theological sophistication. You can even be proud of recognizing your pride, turning self-awareness into another occasion for self-elevation. This suggests that pride may be less like curable disease and more like chronic condition requiring ongoing management rather than expecting complete healing. You don't overcome pride once and for all, but develop practices and awareness that reduce its worst effects while accepting its persistent presence. The therapeutic model proves more realistic than the perfectionist model for most people. You work on pride like working on any personality disorder, making gradual progress while accepting setbacks and limitations. Complete transformation may be theoretical possibility, but isn't practical expectation for most. This creates tension with Aquinas' framework, where sanctity requires genuine humility and pride's persistence constitutes ongoing sin requiring confession and correction. But perhaps the framework needs adaptation to acknowledge that spiritual growth involves reducing pride's extremes while accepting its ongoing presence in diminished form. The question becomes how to live faithfully while remaining significantly proud. Several practices emerge from both therapeutic and spiritual traditions. First, developing metacognitive awareness of pride's operations. You can't eliminate pride entirely, but you can learn to recognize when it's operating. Catch yourself in comparative thinking. Notice defensive reactions. Identify status, anxiety. This awareness doesn't automatically prevent proud behavior, but introduces space between trigger and reaction where choice becomes possible. You feel the defensive reaction arising, but don't immediately act on it. You notice the comparative thought, but don't indulge it. You recognize the need for validation, but don't organize your behavior around securing it. Second, developing compassion for yourself as a proud person. The tendency is to hate your pride, be disgusted by your ongoing narcissism, despair at your failure to change. But this self-hatred often fuels more pride through inverse mechanism. You become proud of recognizing how terrible you are, or your self-condemnation becomes covert self-elevation. Compassionate awareness acknowledges pride's presence without either justifying it or hating yourself for it. You see yourself clearly, including unflattering pride patterns, while maintaining fundamental acceptance that makes change possible. You're imperfect. You're working on it. You'll keep failing. That's the reality of being human. Third, cultivating practices that reduce pride's fuel supply. Social media breaks. Reducing consumption of status signaling content. Avoiding environments that trigger comparative thinking. Choosing activities that don't center self-display and recognition seeking. You can't entirely eliminate pride's triggers while living in contemporary culture, but you can reduce exposure to environments specifically designed to activate pride. This doesn't solve pride, but reduces its constant provocation. Fourth, maintaining relationships with people who see through your performance and love you anyway. Pride thrives in contexts where you can control others' perceptions. It diminishes in relationships where you're genuinely known, where your flaws are visible, where you're accepted despite rather than because of your achievements. These relationships are both uncomfortable and essential. They prevent pride's complete domination by forcing ongoing reality contact. You can't maintain totally false self-image when people who know you well keep reflecting back your actual behavior. Fifth, engaging practices that concretely enact humility even when you don't feel humble. Service to others, submission to legitimate authority, seeking correction, accepting diminishment. You do these not because you've achieved humility, but to practice its external forms in hope they'll gradually shape internal reality. The practice may be pride's occasion initially. You're proud of your service. Feel superior through your submission. Use acceptance of diminishment to demonstrate your virtue. But continued practice can gradually wear down pride's extreme forms, even while not eliminating its subtle presence. Sixth, maintaining humor about your own ridiculousness. Pride takes itself intensely seriously. Humor introduces perspective that deflates pride's gravity. When you can laugh at your own pretensions, your defensive reactions, your need for validation, you've achieved some distance from pride's total dominance. This isn't cynical self-mockery, but gentle awareness of comedy in human self-importance. You're not as important as you think. Your achievements aren't as impressive as you imagine. Your failures aren't as devastating as they feel. Maintaining this perspective reduces pride's intensity. The eschatological dimension provides another resource. If Aquinas is right about final judgment and eternal consequences, then your ongoing pride isn't just personal failing, but spiritual danger requiring serious attention. But the hope is that divine mercy will accomplish the transformation your own efforts can't achieve. This creates interesting psychological dynamic. You work on pride because it matters eternally, but you don't despair when progress is slow because you trust that grace will complete what you've left incomplete. The combination of serious concern and ultimate hope proves more sustainable than either alone. The practical wisdom that emerges involves accepting pride's reality while refusing to accommodate it completely. You're significantly proud and will remain so. This is honest self-assessment, but you keep working to reduce pride's extremes, repair its damage, choose humility when possible. This is ethical commitment despite acknowledged failure. The gap between ideal and reality doesn't mean abandoning the ideal. Aquinas' vision of humility remains valid even if unachievable for most. It provides direction, standard, goal that makes some progress possible even when complete achievement isn't. Living with pride's reality means living in tension between what you are and what you should be, between your actual condition and your aspirations, between human limitation and divine demand. This tension isn't comfortable, but it may be more authentic than either complacent acceptance of pride or despairing recognition that you can't overcome it completely. Part 11. Pride and Modernity's Crisis. Aquinas' analysis of pride provides powerful lens for understanding modernity's spiritual crisis. Contemporary culture systematically cultivates pride while undermining the religious and communal structures that traditionally constrained it. The result is epidemic of narcissism, loneliness, and meaninglessness that no amount of therapeutic intervention seems to address. The logical structure connecting pride to modernity involves several interconnected developments. First, the decline of transcendent reference points that could relativize human pride. If there's no God, no cosmic order, no transcendent meaning, then human desires and judgments become ultimate rather than subordinate to higher authority. Second, the rise of individualism that makes autonomous self the fundamental unit and supreme value. Traditional societies embedded individuals in hierarchies of family, community, tradition that constrained pride through enforcing humility before those structures. Modernity dissolves these constraints by making self-creation and self-expression paramount. Third, consumer capitalism's cultivation of desire and status competition. Modern economy runs on encouraging people to want more, compare themselves to others, seek identity through consumption, display status through visible markers. This systematically activates pride's mechanisms at cultural scale. Fourth, technology's amplification of pride's reach and intensity. Social media allows pride's performance globally, constantly, with instant feedback. The attention economy monetizes narcissism by making self-display profitable both financially and psychologically. Testing this diagnosis against contemporary experience reveals its accuracy. Notice how exhausting it is to maintain self-image across multiple platforms. Notice how anxiety-producing constant comparison becomes. Notice how much energy goes to curating appearance rather than developing substance. Notice how performative everything has become. You don't just have experiences, you document them for display. You don't just have opinions, you broadcast them to establish identity and gain validation. You don't just live life, you craft narrative about living life that serves self-branding purposes. The therapeutic culture that's emerged in response to modernity's crisis often reinforces rather than remedies pride. Self-esteem movement encourages believing in yourself regardless of actual capacity. Positive thinking dismisses limits and difficulties as merely mental obstacles. Authentic self-expression makes your feelings ultimate authority over external standards. These movements aim to help people struggling with shame, inadequacy, self-doubt that modernity generates. But they often intensify the underlying problem by encouraging more sophisticated pride rather than genuine humility. You become proud of your self-esteem, proud of your positive thinking, proud of your authenticity. The crisis of meaning that pervades contemporary life connects directly to pride's corruption. If you're the measure of all things, if your desires and judgments are supreme, then meaning depends entirely on your own construction. But meanings you invent feel arbitrary, temporary, ultimately unsatisfying compared to meanings grounded in transcendent reality. Pride promises autonomy, freedom, unlimited possibility, but it delivers isolation, anxiety, the exhausting burden of self-creation without any external support or validation. You must constantly construct and maintain meaning, identity, worth through your own efforts, while doubting whether any of it matters beyond your own assertion. The loneliness epidemic afflicting developed societies follows directly from pride's relational corruption. Pride makes genuine connection impossible while intensifying need for validation. You're surrounded by potential relationships, but can't achieve the vulnerability and mutual recognition genuine relationship requires. Social media provides appearance of connection while actually deepening isolation. You have hundreds or thousands of followers, but no genuine friends. People like your posts, but don't know your struggles. You perform happy, successful life while suffering privately. The political polarization consuming democracies reflects pride's collective operation. Each tribe is proud of their moral purity, confident in their rightness, contemptuous of opponents they consider not just wrong, but evil. The inability to compromise, admit error, or acknowledge opponents' legitimate concerns follows pride's logic perfectly. Notice how political discourse has become entirely tribal. You don't evaluate claims on their merits, but based on which tribe advocates them. You don't consider evidence, but look for arguments supporting your side. You don't listen to understand, but to find flaws enabling dismissal. This isn't stupidity, but pride operating collectively. Your identity is invested in tribes, righteousness. Your self-worth depends on tribe superiority. Your belonging requires defending tribe against all challenges. Admitting tribe might be wrong, threatens everything pride has constructed. The environmental crisis provides another angle on pride's cultural manifestation. Humanity's relationship to nature has been marked by proud assertion of dominion without acknowledgement of dependence. We've treated Earth as resource to exploit for human benefit, rather than as home requiring careful stewardship. The assumption that human desires and needs should override all other considerations, that nature exists primarily for our use, that we can engineer solutions to any problem our exploitation creates, these reflect pride's fundamental disorder applied to humanity's place in larger ecological order. Now the consequences arrive as climate change, biodiversity collapse, resource depletion threaten the system sustaining human life. But pride makes collective response extraordinarily difficult because it requires acknowledging limits, accepting constraints, subordinating immediate desires to long-term sustainability. The technological optimism that thinks we'll innovate our way out reflects pride's refusal to accept limits. Rather than changing behavior, constraining consumption, accepting smaller footprint, we invest hope in future technologies that will let us maintain current patterns without consequences. Aquinas' framework suggests that addressing modernity's crises requires confronting pride at cultural level, not just individual level. This means rebuilding institutions and practices that constrain pride while cultivating humility. But modern culture is structurally opposed to such constraints, viewing them as oppressive limitations on individual freedom. The challenge is that pride has been consecrated as virtue in modernity. Confidence, self-esteem, believing in yourself, refusing to be limited by others' expectations, all are celebrated as goods rather than recognized as potentially disordered. Humility is dismissed as doormat servility or religious superstition. This makes cultural change extraordinarily difficult. The entire system runs on pride's energy. Questioning it feels like attacking freedom, individuality, progress themselves. Yet the consequences of unconstrained pride at cultural scale become increasingly catastrophic. Part 12. The Enduring Questions. Having examined Aquinas' analysis of pride, its mechanisms, consequences, and cultural manifestations, we must acknowledge the enduring questions that remain inadequately resolved. Pride poses problems that resist final intellectual solution because they touch existence's deepest mysteries about freedom, responsibility, and human nature. The question of whether pride is chosen or inherited generates long-standing theological debate. Is pride original sin transmitted through generations, or do individuals become proud through their own choices? Aquinas' framework involves both elements, but the relationship between them remains murky. If you're born with proud inclination through original sin, how can you be fully responsible for pride's manifestations? If pride develops through choices, what explains its universality across all cultures and times? The question of how much pride is inherent versus acquired affects both pastoral approach and ethical assessment. The question of whether pride can be overcome in this life or only in eternity divides optimistic and pessimistic spiritual traditions. Some saints report achieving genuine humility through grace. Most honest practitioners acknowledge pride's persistent reassertion despite years of spiritual discipline. If pride can be overcome, why do so few overcome it? If it can't be overcome, why demand what's impossible? The tension between demanding transformation and accepting limitation reflects deeper questions about human capacity and divine grace's operation. The question of whether some pride might be necessary for human flourishing challenges Aquinas' framework. Modern psychology suggests some positive self-regard, some confidence in one's abilities, some willingness to assert yourself. These prove necessary for healthy psychological functioning. But where's the line between necessary confidence and disordered pride? Aquinas draws it at accurate self-assessment without disordered elevation. But accurate self-assessment itself depends on pride not corrupting the judgment that assesses accuracy. The potential circularity makes practically distinguishing them extraordinarily difficult. The question of cultural relativity in pride's assessment raises uncomfortable challenges. What counts as disordered self-elevation versus appropriate confidence varies significantly across cultures. American individualistic culture encourages self-assertion that Japanese collectivist culture would consider prideful. Who's right? Aquinas would appeal to natural law accessible to all cultures, but natural law's content itself admits cultural interpretation. Perhaps pride has cultural manifestations requiring different responses rather than one universal pattern. But this risks relativizing moral assessment in ways Aquinas' framework resists. The question of whether intellectual humility requires suspending judgment on important issues where you lack expertise proves practically difficult. In principle, you should defer to experts in domains where they know more than you. But determining who counts as genuine expert, which domains require expertise, when to trust versus question experts, these judgments themselves require exercise of judgment. Pride makes you overconfident in your own ability to assess these questions correctly. But excessive humility makes you vulnerable to manipulation by false experts claiming authority they lack. The balance between appropriate deference and appropriate skepticism proves difficult to maintain. The question of whether pride might sometimes serve good functions generates provocative possibilities. Psychological research suggests that some positive illusions, some self-enhancement, some defensive self-protection, these correlate with better mental health than ruthless self-honesty. Perhaps pride serves adaptive functions in competitive environments where projecting confidence attracts mates, intimidates rivals, motivates achievement. Perhaps evolution selected for pride precisely because it aids survival and reproduction, even at cost of truth and relationship. But this evolutionary account doesn't determine whether pride is virtue or vice. Evolutionary advantage doesn't make something morally good. Murder served evolutionary purposes, but remains evil. Yet the account complicates simple condemnation by revealing pride's potential functionality. The question of how to respond pastorally to proud people without triggering more defensiveness reflects practical challenge clergy face constantly. Directly confronting pride usually generates defensive reaction, making things worse. But avoiding the issue allows pride to continue unchallenged. The pastoral art involves finding indirect approaches that help people see their pride without feeling attacked. But these approaches risk being so indirect they're ineffective, or being manipulative in ways that themselves reflect pride. The tension between directness and indirectness admits no formula. The question of whether pride might be worse than other sins, as Aquinas claims, or whether this ranking reflects bias in his particular religious tradition, deserves consideration. Other traditions emphasize different fundamental sins. Buddhism focuses on ignorance and attachment. Judaism emphasizes idolatry. Islam emphasizes associating partners with God. Perhaps pride is fundamental sin only within Christian framework that emphasizes proper relationship to God's authority. Perhaps other frameworks identify different fundamental disorders that prove equally destructive. The question of whether one framework is objectively correct versus whether different frameworks illuminate different aspects of human corruption remains open. The question of whether overcoming pride would eliminate other sins, or whether other sins have independent roots, challenges Aquinas' claim about pride as root. Empirical observation suggests that humble people can still struggle with anger, lust, laziness, fear, greed. These passions seem to have their own dynamic, partly independent of pride. Perhaps pride isn't sole root, but one root among several. Perhaps sins have complex etiology, where pride contributes, but doesn't solely determine. This wouldn't refute Aquinas entirely, but would complicate his systematic account in ways requiring refinement. The question of what authentic humility looks like in practice remains difficult to specify beyond abstract principles. The humble person accurately assesses their gifts and limitations, seeks good within proper order, acknowledges dependence on God and others. But what does this look like concretely in everyday decisions? Does humility require refusing promotions you're qualified for? Does it mean never asserting your view when you disagree with authority? Does it demand constantly deflecting compliments and highlighting your flaws? These questions lack obvious answers, suggesting humility's practice is more art than science. The ultimate question is whether Aquinas' analysis of pride captures something universally true about human condition, or reflects particular theological and philosophical commitments that could be otherwise. Is pride necessarily humanity's fundamental corruption? Or is that claim itself prideful assertion of one tradition's superiority over alternatives? The question admits no neutral resolution, because any framework for assessing it already presupposes commitments about human nature, truth's accessibility, proper life orientation. You can't evaluate Aquinas' account without standing somewhere, and wherever you stand influences what seems obviously true versus questionable. What remains undeniable is pride's destructive power, its pervasive presence, its resistance to correction. Whether or not it's the root of all sin, it's clearly among humanity's most persistent and damaging tendencies. Aquinas' analysis, even if not final truth, provides profound resources for understanding and addressing this corruption. The problem of pride has no final solution that will satisfy all questioners, because it touches existence's deepest perplexities about freedom, responsibility, and human flourishing. What Aquinas offers isn't closure, but framework for thinking about pride that has illuminated the problem for centuries while being continually challenged and refined. Whether his framework deserves continued acceptance, requires modification, or should be abandoned for alternatives, remains living question that each person must answer based on their own experience of pride's corruption and whatever intimations of authentic humility they encounter in life's journey through both self-assertion and self-surrender.